This is the Galaxy S6 Edge, and it's the exception to the rule that most Galaxies nowadays are a pain to change out the charging port on. And the reason for that is that starting with the Galaxy S5 and all the way up to the S7 and S7 Edge, with the exception of this phone, they have integrated the capacitive buttons into the charging port. So these little tabs down at the bottom on most phones will wrap around and go underneath the screen. And what that means is that you have to remove the screen in order to in order to change out the charging port. So it is not easy to remove the screen. It can be done, but you always risk breaking the AMOLED, which is the most expensive part of the phone. For some reason, they made this phone the exception to the rule. Now, this phone has been opened before, so if you want to see a detailed real-time video showing me remove the back panel for the first time, click on the link up in the corner there, and that will take you through the entire process. But for the time being, I do want to acknowledge this back has been removed before, so you do have to be very careful, and I would go as far as to maybe just ordering a spare just in case. They're very easy to break if you're not careful, because there's adhesive running all the way around the inside that is very sticky, and also there's paint on the back. So if you get between the glass and the paint, you can leave marks along the edge of the back panel. So there are just a number of things that can go wrong. You have to be very careful. I absolutely recommend that you use heat. If you don't have a heat gun, you can try a blow dryer. You want to get this thing as warm as you can, almost to the point where it burns you, but not quite. Because again, if you get it too hot, there's another problem, and that is the paint gets much easier to damage. So there's just kind of a sweet spot you have to hit with this thing. And I am going to start, and by the way, when you're prying glass, please put on some sort of eye protection, because these things end up in the least expected places when they crack, and you want to avoid that for sure. So I'm going to hit this with the heat gun as soon as we get some power here. And let's go this way. All right, so we'll start by heating the surface with the heat gun. Get this nice and warm, and then there are a number of tools you can use to pry this off. I like to use a playing card. If you have something with a plastic core on the inside, it works much better than a standard playing card. Some people like to use the iSesamo. We've got this iFlex tool here. You know, whatever works for you. The main thing is not to damage the back panel by putting any stress on it or putting too much stress on it, and also not to damage the paint underneath. So again, I am going to acknowledge this phone has been opened before, so this is going to look much easier than it is. But I still use the same method to get this started. If you find an area, I usually come in right about here and make sure that you get right between the glass and the bezel on the side of the phone. And if you do that, you can actually press straight down, and you're not going to be able to damage anything, because you'll see on the inside that the mid frame is all you're pushing up against. And if you very gently just start to lift this, just enough that you can get the edge of another pry tool underneath here. Don't lift it very far. If you do, the glass will crack. Again, like I said, very easy to damage this one, but you should be able to make enough room that you can kind of get your playing card in here. Now, you don't have to pry very far inside as you start to work your way around, but just continuously heat the back surface, but keep that heat off your card, because if you get that too hot, it's going to start getting all floppy, and then it won't, of course, give you or be strong enough in any case to make it all the way around. So from here, what I do is just kind of slowly work my way around the edges. And as you can see, I am still between the panel itself and the mid frame, and I haven't got in between the paint and the panel. And that is the biggest risk on this one. So again, don't expect this to go very fast. You really have to take your time, and I usually just work my way around. Continue to apply heat here if you feel like it's kind of slowing down and getting gummed up. And you can seriously feel when the temperature is dropping on the adhesive, because it just gets much more difficult to cut through. All right, so once we get this back panel, kind of worked all the way around, and I'll go around a couple times if necessary, but eventually you should get to the point where you can just very carefully start to pull it away from the back, and then you can take a look at this. And another reason I recommend getting a replacement back panel is because if you don't, you're going to have to redo all this adhesive on the inside by hand, and it's kind of a headache. So if your replacement panel, if you order one of these replacement panels, make sure it has the adhesive around the edges. If you haven't already done so, go ahead and remove the SIM card tray. Doesn't matter if there's a card in there or not, but we do need to get the tray out because it goes through the bezel, and it will be a problem when we go to open up the phone. Also, there may be a small amount of adhesive right down the edge of the NFC here. So what you want to do is just kind of very carefully get underneath this black piece and then kind of lift it up. And you might have to work your way down the edges. You don't want to tear that. So just carefully go up to right about here where the corner is, because we want to make sure that that doesn't get stuck to the bezel as we separate it away from the battery. So once you have those two things taken care of, you want to go ahead and remove all of the perimeter screws, including this one right here in the center. And these screws can be slightly challenging when it comes to removing them from the frame. So you have two options. You can either go after them with a pair of tweezers, sort of like this, once you have them backed out of the threads all the way, or you can just make sure that they're completely unwound and then cover them with something like cellophane tape so that they don't fall out of the frame when you take the phone apart. I'm going to go ahead and take these out. So let's speed this up for a second. Now, if you find that it's too difficult to remove these screws, they don't necessarily have to come out of the frame, but what we're trying to accomplish here is to not lose any of them. And when we separate the front panel, or the front half of the phone from the outer bezel here, there's a good chance that these are going to go flying across the room. So I recommend that you put some tape over them. I'm not going to do that right now because I'm going to very carefully just turn the phone here sort of over to the side. And then if you just grip the bezel in this area, you can push against the battery and you'll see that with a small amount of force, as long as we have all of the screws unwound, and it looks like I skipped one here. Okay, as long as we have all the screws unwound, you should be able to push behind the battery and see this separating. Now, if you don't, go back and check and make sure that you do have all the screws pulled out from the frame. But if you do, you should then be able to continue working your way around. And you might run into some adhesive up in the corners, but if you just gently push, you'll see that the front starts to separate from the bezel. And when it does, you just want to kind of open it this way and then slide it over towards the bottom, because the headset jack and the charging port kind of go down inside the housing here. So this kind of slips over the top there. So it'll go over that way. And as you can see, my screws are still there. So again, the important thing is that we don't lose these. I'm going to go ahead and leave a few of those in the frame for now. Set that off to the side. Now, starting on the inside of the phone, we have a few cables that we need to disconnect. You can either use something like this with a very thin edge. Precision tweezers work also. But for the flex cables themselves, I like to use these. And the first thing we want to do is disconnect the battery. So this cable over here, and just to emphasize, I am not going to push this down and use it as a pry in the sense that I'm not pushing down against the phone. All I'm going to do is go underneath the cable and lift it away, so that way we're not putting any pressure on these surrounding components. And there are some very small pieces here. You might have to hold the board down also. But if you just gently kind of lift, and I'd come in from this side, this is kind of a safer area, you should be able to disconnect the battery. And we're going to do that because, again, you have a lot of tiny little components here that you have to be careful not to scrape. So if people get too aggressive digging in here with their fingernail, it's easy to damage those. And there's a row right over here by the display connector also. So we'll go ahead and get the head phone jack connector unplugged right there. Then we're going to have our main display flex cable. And I usually go in from one corner here or the other, because as I mentioned, we have some things down in between the connector itself and this metal shielding that are very, very small and very difficult to replace if you damage them, and they will affect your display. So again, can't emphasize enough, just be very careful as you disconnect these three cables. And then we're going to have one more down here, and this is going to be that runs to our home button. So this is what controls your home button and fingerprint scanner functionality. And then we'll move on to the antenna wires right down here. And for these, I would recommend you use a pair of precision tweezers. A lot of people can do it with their fingernails, but whatever you do, make sure you're getting under the metal part and don't pry under the wire itself, because these are very easy to damage. And do take note of their orientation. We want to make sure that we get them down inside these channels again when we go to put the phone back together. So I'm going to, again, very carefully just kind of lift here. And we've got those unplugged. Now I'm pulling them back so they're just kind of out of the way. like so. Flip this over, and then we have our final connector here, and I usually just grab this one with my fingers because it's so easy to manipulate. So there's your logic board. We'll set that aside. What we need to do now, of course, is to remove the old charging port. So to do that, we have a couple of screws, one that goes through the headphone jack here and one over here to the side, and you will have to save these antenna wires and transfer them to your new part. So do be sure to hold on to this. In fact, I recommend people hold on to everything even after they complete their repair, just in case, because you never know when you might go back and say, hey, I needed that part, and if you threw it away, well, then you get to wait and order something else in the mail. So those are our two screws. As you can see, they're very different than the rest of the screws in the phone. And from here, we can just kind of get these antennas wires out of the way. And over here, we have one little guy with a small amount of adhesive just holding it in. So obviously, if you're replacing this, you shouldn't have to worry too much about it, but I'm going to be very careful about getting this out because this is going to go back in. There we go. So there's your charging port. And your new one should look just like this, minus the antenna wires. They are model specific, so make sure that you order the right charging port for your phone. And by that, I mean the Galaxy S6 Edge for AT&T or the Galaxy S6 Edge for Verizon and so on. They all have a unique charging port. So if you take a look here, let's refocus this real quick. You'll see that on the port, there's a model number. On this one, it's a G925A and revision 0.4H. That is exactly the part that I would order for this phone. There's a possibility that there's a few that are compatible, but most of the time not. So a lot of times AT&T and T-Mobile might be compatible. Sprint may be compatible with the international version, but that's not always the case. So by all means, buy the right part for your phone. And I'm going to go ahead and just put this back together. So we'll keep the video running just in case you need assistance with that. But it's all pretty much the reverse of the disassembly. We'll put our port down here in the bottom, get the screws in, and then we can get our logic board back into position. This is always fun. These antenna wires are going to be in my way. Get this at an angle where it's easy for you to see what you're doing, because lining these up can be challenging sometimes. However, you can also try this. It works a lot of the time. If you need help lining this thing up, a lot of times if you lay the charging port down flat inside the frame and get all these wires out of the way and just give it a very gentle little push there, it may plug in, but it doesn't look, there we go. So I actually felt it plug in there. Got lucky, but I'm still going to open it up, turn this over, and make sure that's fully connected. In fact, I heard it kind of pop again. So I have people do that sometimes when they're really struggling to get this lined up. If you can do it by hand, it's much better, but if you have to, just go ahead and lay the board down inside the frame and make sure you don't set it on top of any cables, of course. And then from here, we will reconnect our home button. And we'll install or connect the display. And then these are always the most fun. Again, they have to be down in these little channels that are designed for them, but getting them to line up on the board is probably the most challenging part of this repair, outside of not breaking the rear panel, because these things will often seem like they're lined up when in fact they aren't. There we go. So we got one, but you see how this is off to the side? That's not going to work out because it's going to get cut in half probably somewhere along here. So we want to make sure that we get this guy over. And if you end up with reception problems after you repair, it is most likely because one of these antenna wires was damaged and you will have to order another, or you installed the wrong charging port. So a lot of times if you get the wrong carrier or the wrong model number for your port, it may in fact charge the phone, but you will often run into signal issues with cellular and data connections. So be sure you get the right one. I know I said it too many times now. These things really annoy me. I'm probably just gonna have to bring it a lot closer, which makes it hard to keep it in front of the camera. All right, so there we go. So I got those two snapped in. They're sitting down where they're supposed to be. And from here, when you reinstall this back into the panel, you want to not turn it upside down like I just did. Fortunately, I didn't lose any more screws. I still have my two set aside over there to the side. But you want to come in from the bottom because the charging port has to kind of rest down inside this hole. So we just slide it over this direction. And then you can very carefully just kind of work your way around, and you feel this thing will seem like it's not quite in all the way. Like it might feel like it's, you know, separated here a bit. But when you put the screws in, that kind of pulls the frame up against the display assembly. So usually if you do 3 or 4 of these screws, especially on the what would be the left-hand side of the phone, you'll see that pulls everything back into position. And from here, we will, of course, want to put our panel back on. So if you don't have the pre-installed adhesive, I recommend you get something like the red tape, 3M, TISA, any of the above work. It's not like there's going to be a lot of pressure pushing against that, but something like this on the inside. I usually go with about a 3mm, try to match that size as much as you possibly can to the original. I'm not going to do that today because I've got to take this phone apart again for another video entirely.